2023 Board of County Commissioners meeting. Welcome to those who've showed up today. Is there a motion on the Clerk General?
So moved.
And yes?
Yes. And there were just a couple of requisitions.
Yeah, I just have one question. The Kings Mills infrastructure, Deerfield Township, what's
Yes,
that?
so that is a project that we are in cooperation with Deerfield Township. It's a replacement of an 8-inch water line with a 12-inch. So anytime we work in coordination with another entity, we will pay our portion of whatever the infrastructure improvements that are ours, so that if they're doing improvements to a roadway, that's what that is, or they're paving, we will do it at the same time so we don't have to tear it up twice. So that's our portion of the bid. It's actually an OPWC project.
Okay, and so they're paying a portion of it too?
Yes, they are. They're paying, I just looked at it yesterday, they're paying, I think it's an equal amount. So they're paying $900 and some thousand, we're paying $900 and some thousand, and then OPWC's picking up a portion.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I have no problem. Move to accept those. And yes?
Yes. Okay, the next item on our agenda is a work session with Carrie Furness, the CFO of Warren County ESC.
I could probably tee this up if that's all right, since it kind of came at my ask. I was talking to my buddy, the Honorable Tom Isaacs, the other day, and what was going on. We were talking about housing, we were talking about big developments, we were talking about that all coming back. And I asked a very simple question that used to be the standard around here of what was the price point per house that made it close to being equal to the value of the home, kind of paying theoretically for that child attending the school. And I threw out, is it 400,000, 500, you know, the numbers I remember a long time ago being discussed, and Tom said, no, that's totally changed. And I said, if I don't know it, we probably ought to talk about it again, because we are seeing a lot more housing developments pop in. And again, schools are not in our purview, but it's one of those factors that clearly affect the community. And I thought from an informational standpoint, it would be good to get more information on that subject.
Commissioners, thank you for the invitation this morning. Carrie Furness is the new CFO of the ESC effective June 1, so welcome Carrie. And certainly this idea of what is the impact of residential housing on school districts is a really important issue, and really appreciate your wisdom in trying to learn more about that. And the bottom line that Carrie's going to share with you is that residential housing without commercial is very, very detrimental to school district funding. So as houses are built, of course, kids come with it, and as kids come, we need to build classrooms, so we have bond issues in the future. And based on what's happening with Ohio's school funding system, school districts do not benefit from residential housing by itself. But Carrie has a really interesting presentation for you, and I think, Carrie, you're going to share a number of about $810,000.
That's probably that's the big finale.
For a house, but it's going to be an interesting presentation, so thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As I said, this is day 4, so I'm jumping in with both feet. Happy to be here. I have just a little context about myself. I have 35 years that I've been school treasurer. I started in the 9th grade. I was also about 6'3" when I started. I've also lived in Warren County since 1991, so I've been here through the last 3 to 4 decades of growth and seeing the county change in a very, very positive way over that time frame. Obviously, with Warren County ESC, we wouldn't miss an opportunity to just reiterate we are a high-performing ESC. And my buttons are going a little crazy for 7 consecutive years. Goals today are to identify some of the economic differences in our schools, support that our schools are high-quality, low-cost providers. I can't seem to get this done. Explain the impact of the housing on our schools, how it relates to the state funding formula, which has changed 2 years ago with the Fair School Funding Plan. We're going to talk about that today. These 2 funnel graphs really break down for you territorially the square miles of our school districts. I have included Clinton and Massey, Loveland, and Monroe because they have significant development territory in Warren County. And you can see, I believe there's some relationship here when you look at the amount of available land versus the per pupil density. Areas where we've seen significant development, like Mason, Loveland, Kings, we have high densities, lower square mileages. I think just by the common sense, common man's approach, we can drive through these communities and see they've developed pretty significantly.
Are you saying that the average school district in Ohio is 68 square miles
That is
and they
correct.
have 96 students per mile?
Yeah, I thought the state information would provide you a benchmark on how Warren County compares across the state of Ohio. When you look at areas like Lebanon, Little Miami, and Wayne local schools, obviously their densities are low, they have some significant square miles, and I think, again, we can reasonably discern that they have a lot of area for potential development and impact. We look at tax base, we've included the state of Ohio in this analysis. When you look at tax base, our schools are primarily reliant upon local revenue. Little Miami being the highest at 93% of their tax base is agricultural and residential property. Franklin, the school district primarily Warren County being the lowest. And almost all of our districts are above the state average in that regard. When we look at our revenues, consequently, our schools are primarily locally funded. Only Carlisle and Franklin are below the state average. Most of our districts are above it. And where we've seen more growth through the years, those districts have become more heavily reliant on local revenue. Simply because they need additional facilities, capital projects to keep up with growth, and then obviously the operations that go with that and its relationship to how state funding works or has worked in Ohio. Over the last 30 plus years, we've been in the context of having an unconstitutional school funding formula. That changed with the Cupp-Patterson Fair School Funding Model. I will tell you that I'm an advocate for it, simply because it provides a predictable and projectable level of revenue. It uses a base cost inputs approach. What does that mean? It means effectively, in simple terms, if you took all the cost of every school in Ohio and averaged them, that becomes your base cost input. That's sort of the gist of the conversation with the state budget is what cost inputs will they use. Currently, we're using 2018 data. We know that costs have changed a lot since 2018. And so that has a big impact on what state funding will be across the state, but as we're going to show you, that won't make a lot of difference in Warren County. With respect to cost, our school districts are high-quality, low-cost providers. All of our districts, except one, are below the state average on cost per pupil. I will advocate for my colleague from Franklin today, while theirs is higher than the state of Ohio, they have a very high percentage of handicapped students in relationship to the rest of the state. Students with handicaps and disabilities cost more money to educate.
Has this gone up a lot lately? I used to remember $8,000 per student in a lot.
We changed the calculation.
Okay.
So that it makes it more difficult. That's what we do in school finance. We change the calculation so it makes it difficult to compare. Part of that was with the Fair School Funding Model. That change occurred primarily because in that approach, we used to carry the cost of students that never attended our buildings, which might be on autism scholarship or John Peterson scholarship or for community schools. Those students would flow into our revenue and then we'd be deducted out that expense. When that model changed, so those schools are directly funded, which was a very positive move for Warren County schools, those expenses went away and the calculation changed. So comparing to where we were 10 years ago is somewhat difficult. We can do it. There's a little bit of math to it, and if that's something the commissioners would like me to follow up with, I'd be happy to do that, to give you some comparison of that over time.
So you're saying the average in Warren County is $12,000 or $13,000
Yeah, we're
closer?
about, on average, at least $1,500 per pupil less than the state average. And in some cases, when you look at Springboro, we're closer to $4,000 below the state average.
And what, since we're on, I was actually going to ask about that. Do you happen to know offhand what some of the urban districts are, like Cincinnati Public? What is the
We're well
cost?
above state average. Cincinnati, for example, I believe is over 17,000.
I thought it was 22,000 in Cincinnati Public.
It could be, yes.
All right, That's, okay, that's good, because I always like to know that number versus a Warren County number. Okay,
If I were to throw up all 612 school districts, Warren County would be right down in the point rows of that graph. We're, again, I believe we have high-quality schools, and we provide that at a low cost.
So when you measure this cost per pupil, and you've given the state average is the one that says State of Ohio, that's a slightly lighter color of blue, is that right? Do you take a look at all the costs that a school is operating with, all the costs, and then you compare that to the number of students that are employed? Is that how you make that math?
Yes, with a couple of key
But
exceptions.
so you don't include in that, of course, the students that are going to private schools.
Correct.
So even though they're paying taxes that go to the public schools, their students aren't involved with this equation.
Correct. So with cost, on that side of the ledger first, it is all operating costs minus debt service and capital outlay, construction. On the revenue side, the easiest way, the most plain way I can put it, the revenue is calculated and the cost is divided by butts and seats. How many kids are sitting in Warren County buildings in that particular school district? In the past, we had all of these other extraneous students that were included in there, lots of moving parts. So I believe we have a better calculation today than what we had historically and more accurate. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, okay.
Very good.
so just so I understand that, you still get, if child number one goes to a private Catholic school or whatever it is, his or her parents are still paying taxes, so the revenue's still coming in, but yet that's one less student, so that is still factored in. You don't have the butt in the seat. So that's,
Correct.
you get the revenue, so it's actually good for the district because you're getting the revenue and not the expense.
Correct.
All right,
It's a cost neutral proposition when that occurs. If we had the ability to determine when someone moves into a new home whether they would attend or not, that would sort of make things a little easier for us. So that's some background, some fabric, if you will, a little bit with how school funding has evolved and some of how we determine cost and revenue. Obviously, housing and the cost of housing has changed dramatically. I know that that's an issue and a concern for the commissioners. And I'm here today to provide information, advance that dialogue, and then if there's ways that we can help in problem solving, we're anxious to do that. Information that I pulled from Redfin, whether you're a Redfin fan or a Realtor fan or a Zillow fan, pretty much the data was about the same, that on the past month, median sale price for a home in Warren County was $355,000. I was at a meeting on Friday with Matt Nolan and Scott Lips. They quoted some data that basically, in simple terms, that a starter home's approaching $300,000 in Warren County. It's really quite phenomenal when you hear yourself say that out loud. Over this period of time, it would appear that the median sale price is at $355,000 for Warren County, and that's a very robust number. So I'm going to use that in looking at what a break-even analysis would be, which is the road that Tom's kind of stolen my thunder a bit, but we'll roll up to that regardless. So the table I have here, we're assuming that with a new home, if we have one new student in that home, we use our current tax rates that our schools are levying, and we look at our current state funding support, using that $355,000 median sale price, I've calculated what a break-even point would be at that sale price. As you can see, all of our schools would be underwater. Now, one of the first things that jumps out when you look at this table is that most of the schools are not receiving new state revenue. So with fair school funding, most of our schools benefited from that scholarship deduction going away. But 6 of our 8 schools are on a guarantee, meaning that the phase-in of the new formula has not caught up to them. And a guarantee means they're getting what they've received in 2018 for revenue. And when we look at the simulations, whether we use cost inputs from 2018, 2020, or 2022, that's going to be the scenario for 2 more years. Why is that the case? Well, the state of Ohio doesn't have enough money we're one of the 5 wealthiest counties with how they're measured for schools in the state of Ohio. We have a very high federal adjusted gross income by relationship to the state of Ohio. So as that formula begins to work, we're going to be very, very low on the list before it starts to impact our schools in a positive way. So when we make this assumption, while there will be a new student, the movement will be that our school districts who grow enrollment will be less on the guarantee, if that makes sense. So we'll use some simple math. Let's say the new formula will provide $1 million less for a particular school district. As you have new students, then that would go to 990,000 or whatever the number would be for that district, until you grow enough that you could potentially see new state money for base aid. Right now, in the next 2 years, with every simulation that we see, only Franklin and Carlisle will see new revenue from the next phase into the Fair School Funding Formula.
You kind of lost me there, so,
Okay?
which is easy to do in the school funding world. So, certain wealthier districts, because they knew this new way of looking at the calculation, would hammer them immediately from state funding, so they got a guarantee of it's not gonna go down.
Correct.
Because you're such a wealthy community, we, the state, are not gonna give you as much money.
Correct.
But they're kicking that can down the road and saying, we're gonna phase that in over time to get you to where you need to be. So
Correct.
essentially, that new formula hurts our wealthier districts.
You could make that argument, but I would tell you that we have just spent the last 14 years on a guarantee or a gain cap without the Fair School Funding Formula. And we were subject to whatever happened every 2 years to try to determine how we were going to do the math. Now we have a predictable formula that we can project this. So from the standpoint of, on the surface, yes, Warren County would look at the Fair School funding and say, this has done nothing for us. And in the short term, that is accurate. In the long term, though, I believe there will be, when it's fully phased in, some potential for help. At the same time, once we're fully phased in, the big key for us is how they calculate capacity. Maybe you hear about the charge-off. Capacity is what is the capacity of the local community to support itself before the state's going to help us. And that's a combination, it used to be exclusively property value. Now it's a combination of property value and income. By every metric you would measure, Warren County is a blessed place. We're blessed with respect to the state of Ohio, probably this country, and probably the entire planet. And we're to be proud of that. The investments and the decisions that have been made are a reflection in that. But we're likely going to need to become fully phased in before we can work with our legislators to look at that capacity calculation, how it's impacting wealthier communities and counties, and how we can still help our local communities, because, as I showed you earlier in this presentation, this burden falls to our communities to solve these issues right now, and at least for the next 2 years.
Is that just a factor of, not to go down that rabbit hole too much, but the only way we fund schools locally is through the property tax? So,
Not exclusively.
well,
Not exclusively, we have a couple of other
okay,
options.
but from a local level,
Yes,
it is. And so when they say it's income is also a factor, is that just saying, okay, if you need more money, go raise your property taxes?
yes. Or you can balance that with class 2 development, such as commercial real estate, industrial property, and public utilities, whether that be a pipeline or just additional infrastructure. Those are areas that help fill the gap that identified in that table. We fill that through, again, commercial, public utility, industrial. Probably one of the examples that's best in that regard out of the information I've shared with you is Monroe. They're receiving roughly 17% of their money, revenues, from non-tax entities, which tells me, without having been in the Monroe School District, that a lot of commercial development. They've likely participated in TIFs and CRAs and enterprise zones. So they're receiving probably a high likelihood of pilot payments, payments in lieu of taxes. And they have a nice mix of commercial, some industrial, and residential property. And you can see they have the lowest tax rate and also want to lower costs for pupils. Balance is the key. We're heavily residential because this is a very desirable place to live. And we have many amenities. So we have to work hard and create dialogue, provide information to stress how important it is that we have that balance, because every commercial property, industrial property produces no students. It only produces revenue. It helps provide that balance without just asking for a local levy.
Well, let me ask you a question, but also tell the public who may be listening to this some of what I think you just said. So the schools locally are raising funds through their property tax and through real estate tax, which gets evaluated by our auditor, and that's their primary source of revenue locally is through that tax. Then you mention, of course, a commercial property or industrial property pays a real estate tax, unless they're a non-taxed entity for some reason, and they'll pay that real estate tax too, which then, like 70% of that usually goes for the school's taxes. And then you mention a pilot. So a jurisdiction maybe gives a tax incentive, and one of the things they're allowed to do under state law is to abate their real estate tax. But frequently that local jurisdiction will only do that if the school district and that entity or whoever owns that property will reach an agreement with the school district or with the public entity giving them that tax break to pay a amount of money that's specified during a certain period of time instead of paying the real estate tax. So they pay the school. That's the pilot, the payment in lieu of taxes. So are those basically the ways that we raise money locally for our schools, the real estate tax and the payment in lieu of taxes?
Yes, sir.
That's it, right?
That's it.
Okay.
So at this point, I would obviously ask you if you have other questions, but the big question I didn't include in here, what is the number it takes to break even? We gave it away at the top. It's around $800,000. And I spoke with Auditor Nolan. We're not with the precise exact number, but we're really close. We're in that same time frame. That break-even point, if we were exclusively doing this on the backs of houses with one student, it would take about an $800,000 home in most of our schools for that break-even.
And that's assuming one child in the home.
That's assuming one child. So there will be some with none.
Some with
There'll be some with 5. If I could predict accurately how many students would move in particular homes, while I've enjoyed this experience, I wouldn't be here today because I could do something else probably more lucrative. That is the real struggle that I've seen in my 35 years in this business with half of my career here in Warren County, trying to determine how many and where they are coming from. And so I think when you look at the schools that we have and the quality of services they provide, I think we've done a really, really good job over that time frame, and I think we will continue to do so.
But part of your job also with this predictive modeling, there are certain school districts that are closer to being completely built out. There's not a lot of residential land, and if anything, some of the enrollment numbers are actually turning over. And I don't know if that's a short-term phenomenon, it's kind of generational. Hey, the family raised their kids, now they're retiring. But then if they sell it to a new young family, then all of a sudden it happens again. Is that the case?
Yeah, you will see a plateau, and you have other communities that have gone through that. You're more of your second-ring suburbs. You can look in the Cincinnati model. You could look at your Sycamore. You could look at your Princeton. They were very large, then they fell back, and now they've plateaued. They plateau because of their facilities, because of their programming, and the offerings they have to their students. In addition to that, it's the quality of life with housing, work, play. Those all become factors. I don't think we're going to see a mass exodus anytime soon from Warren County, even if everyone, if we stopped all building. I think folks, because it's desirable, are still going to want to put their kids in certain schools, live in certain communities for work or recreation or whatever the case may be. And so if you provide a high-quality service, they will come.
Thank you, Mr. Furness,
You're
for
welcome.
being
Thank
here
you for your
today.
time
I
today.
have a question, please. thanks for being here and welcome to Warren County in this capacity. And I look forward to working with you on our Council of Government, which we work cooperatively with the ESC. I recall that there is kind of a simple indicator for purposes of understanding what the contribution is from the local community, a simple factor that the state utilizes.
The local effort index.
Yes, so can you remind me what that is?
It is a combination of how much property tax rate a community has.
Valuation, right?
Well, tax rate and valuation and federal adjusted gross income. I can go back and get the calculation for you.
But, so it's been a while since I've been in the General Assembly, and I'm certainly not familiar with the intricacies of Cup-Patterson, though I think I understand everything that you're sharing and certainly have been privy to all the conversations about our previous school funding formulas. It always goes, I mean, the basic point is that even in this new Savior formula, it's not fully funded, and it's always a question of how much the state is going to dedicate to this. And so there's always this tension between those in this community that send a disproportionate amount of our taxes to the state and then redistribute it and get back pennies on the dollar. What is a better way to fund our schools? And there are many here that believe that property taxes, especially when you have such high valuations, is a more efficient way for dollar, if I support these schools, every dollar I levy on myself is going to go directly to the thing that I want to fund. So there's that tension that exists. So I do remember, though, this factor being a really important measure, at least from the General Assembly's perspective, as we were evaluating the efficacy of that model. Whatever the model was, as you point out, it changes every 2 years. This one we've had for a little more. I guess, will be up to the whims of the General Assembly in the future to determine whether or not they keep it or fully fund it. But I remember that factor being one,
That would be your state average.
it was what the state average was. That's that half of the some of the communities contributed more in property tax valuation, some of them contributed less, meaning this was the ability of the local community to support its local schools. And so I'd love to know now what our schools are contributing relative to what the state says we should be contributing as our local share.
I'm familiar with it. It's the local effort index. We have schools that are above 1. We have some that are below. I can provide that information as well as what the inputs are on how it's calculated. I've never used it a lot in my career. I've always felt like it's a little bit of a shame factor for a community, that if you're below 1, that we really need your support, and the state says you can do more. Never really felt like that never felt like a good approach if we were asking a community for support. But I know exactly what you're referencing, and it is a factor in how state funding is calculated. And that's what I was referencing earlier with the capacity. And I'm one person. I have one opinion, however strong. It might be very strong in school finance, but getting fully phased in before then we start working on individual components of it to help it be better feels like that's the right approach, and that's the stance I've taken for these 2 years and what I advocate to my colleagues, and I still stand by that. I do think the capacity going forward is the key for Warren County, Delaware County, other counties that have seen more growth. And so I will follow up.
Yeah, I certainly,
with that
I don't
information.
disagree with that choice at all. In fact, if we have as somebody who is partially responsible for putting caps and guarantees on the formula, budget after budget after budget. I agree with you. Having that predictability, if I were in your shoes, would be really important.
Well, and to be fair, the old formula was pushing nearly 300 districts to the guarantee. And if we had kept it in place in the last budget cycle, we would have 500 districts on the guarantee. We have less than 100 now. Just 6 of those 100 are in Warren County.
Yeah.
And so, try to look at it, try to have that balance to advocate for our hometowns. At the same time, look at the big picture here, look at the trend of where we're headed, and does that make sense?
Yeah, as I said,
I think we're
I
on the same
completely agree
page.
with you. My frustration is that there is a lack of funding the formula to what the formula says. So I'm in agreement. I
That's
never
where-
support, I mean, by virtue of, there's only so much money that the state's willing to put in, we're just rearranging the deck chairs, and it's a different way to do it. And so with this model, if there is an intention to look at what the costs are in 2023, 24, 25, and then fully funding that, I think, that makes the most sense. Until that happens, though, it's like, what are all the other factors that are playing into this? And call me suspicious that future general assemblies will necessarily share our love for Cup-Patterson, or the desire for consistency and predictability in school funding. But all of that notwithstanding, I just would love to kind of know the answer to the question, and I appreciate you getting back with
I will
me
get
on that
back to you.
factor.
Very good.
I'm just wondering so the takeaway on this is that the average house, the average pupil ratio does not cover the costs of educating that student each year. All right. So when we increase housing in the county and therefore increase the number of pupils, we are further burdening, your point is we're further burdening the schools with a negative influx of finances to pay for that student.
So without the balance of commercial property, whether it be in real estate, industrial, public utility, those are the things that help fill that gap, and then may determine how long those requests go in the form of a local levy.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So, from a layman's point of view, there still is a situation, because again, I don't know this nearly, I mean, Commissioner Jones was in the middle of this for a long time, that there is still a little bit of the Robin Hood, you're taking from the
There
wealthier.
always will
Yeah,
be.
yeah.
There always will be.
That's the
only thing
whole
that's different
nature of the
from where we've been,
formula.
The biggest takeaway for you with respect to state funding is that the formula is now designed to work individually for each district. So we used to move, there was a continuum of 10% at the bottom or 5% at the bottom and 90 at the top. And if CAUV went up and rural farming schools got wealthier, the suburbans benefited if they stayed the same, because everyone moved in relationship to everyone else. With Cup-Patterson, everyone moves on their own data, which puts the state more at risk financially if a lot of districts move negatively. But it does take away a little bit of the partisan of our school districts with a state as diverse as Ohio, that we have certain parts of the state battling other parts of the state. We stand on our own data and own merits now, and that's a big shift, and one we have to continue to educate our communities about.
One thing that surprises me on your tax base chart is obviously all the districts are important. We're very proud of all the districts. Two of our biggest districts are Kings and Mason. And Kings, I believe, just passed another levy that made them the highest tax rate inside of the county. And I was under the impression that that was primarily due to the fact there's not as much business valuation inside of the Kings district versus a Mason per se. But on your tax base chart, it actually shows that it's fairly close, 74% for Kings and 79% for Mason. Is that? the case that it is fairly close?
So Kings in particular, having served there as treasurer, they are going through a change because of the elimination of the TIFs in Deerfield Township. So they've had sort of an influx of new construction that's been there for 20 years. So that's continued to evolve. Now what will happen though, they're gonna lose state aid over, you'll see in the simulations, they'll receive a little bit of state aid in year one. They'll probably lose $500,000 of state aid in year two because there's a phase-in over a 3-year period. So the properties that were in the TIFs will become fully phased into that capacity, and they will begin to see state aid erode.
So even though they're already the highest tax rate, you're saying that potentially could change even more because they're gonna lose even more state dollars?
That very well could be. That would be my best guesstimate today on the 6th of June. We'll know more once the conference committee is finished and we see the budget and we have a chance to digest it. But anything that happens positively on a local level with our tax base, with the income of our residents, is not going to then have the state of Ohio look at that and say, hey, we're really happy for you.
Yeah, I think it's important. Again, this isn't solely in our purview, but I think it's an important factor when we do things like zoning and what do we want this community to look like? And it reminds me, when I first ran about 20 years ago, this was actually one of the things I ran on, was the word you kept using, was balanced growth. We were the second fastest, I believe, TIF back in the day, growing county when I first ran, and it was almost exclusively residential. And there had been plenty of studies. I read a specific case study from a school district in the Northeast where it was a suburban, large, urban core with a suburban district, and all of a sudden it became a hot community. It started taking off, more and more residential construction. Everybody was loving it. Hey, look, we're growing, we're doing all these great things. But with more and more rooftops, what happened? More and more families, which meant more and more kids, and then all of a sudden they didn't have the classroom capacity to provide the education for their kids, so they had to start construction and building, and the only group that was there was the residential property owners. So all of a sudden, levy after levy and, assessment, whatever way they were funding it up there, and all of a sudden it became price prohibitive. They stopped passing those. All of a sudden the quality of the school district dropped dramatically, housing values dropped. It was this vicious cycle of they priced themselves out of a great community almost exclusively because they didn't have balanced growth. And I think this has been a good refresher course, at least from my standpoint, of reminding us that balance is the key of
Balance
having a
is the
healthy
key.
community.
Balance is the key. And, specifically with Kings and Mason, well, you saw from some of the charts that are more developed, they've been able to help their communities a little bit because they are starting to get their debt retired. There have been reductions in their bond retirement rate, which help because there may be an operating levy. There's a little bit of a trade of the millage too, and that happens as communities mature out. But I really appreciate your time today and your attention. We welcome the dialogue, and hopefully I'll have the opportunity to come back again.
Great, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Commissioner Jones, I know that you're discussing a sewer extension in the Little Miami School District, and I did want to introduce Regina, if you would see. Regina Morgan is the new superintendent of Little Miami, effective August the 1st, and Terry Gamba is the treasurer of Little Miami.
Great, thank you. Thanks for being here. Okay, is there anyone else before I take a motion to go into executive session? Is there anyone else here who wishes to speak on this? Tina, do you have anything else for the
I
commission
do,
to
I have one
consider?
add-on. I have a resolution to approve the memorandum of understanding and agreement with the Southwest Ohio Council of Governments on behalf of Ohio Means Jobs, Warren County, and Warren County Department of Human Services. This is just for their summer youth program.
So moved.
And yes? Anything else?
That's it.
Tiffany or Martin? So do I have a motion to go into executive session regarding the acquisition of property pursuant to ORC 121.22 G2?
that is my motion.
All right, second,
And roll call, please.
Mrs. Jones?
Yes?
Mr. Grossman?
yes.
Mr. Young?
Yes.
Moving
Thank
back.
you.